afternoon to welcome Professor Lefebvre to the Student Faculty Seminar of the President's Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. Professor Lefebvre is the Andrew Tisch and James Tisch Distinguished University Professor of History Emeritus at Cornell. He's one of the great historians of his generation, and particularly so in the history of American foreign policy. We will get a full account of his accomplishments this evening when at 8 o'clock in the University Theater he will present a lecture on the American century, its beginnings and its end. And this afternoon his topic is Reconsidering the Roots of the American Empire. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Professor Borgman, and thank you for almost promoting me to the philosophy department. I appreciate that very much. The philosophy department at Cornell, as I was saying to Professor Borgman, was a very distinguished department, lost several senior people. And there would be many historians back in the 70s and 80s who would have been very happy to have been part of the philosophy department at that time. I am very grateful for being invited to be the presidential speaker. And when I was told about this, I knew what I was supposed to do tonight, but I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to do this afternoon. So what I plan to do this afternoon is to talk about, as Professor Borgman said, essentially the roots of the American empire that go back into the late 19th century. And the way I want to do this is to begin with how this was viewed, very briefly, how this was viewed back in ancient times when I was a graduate student, and then how it evolved over the late 20th century to the present. I'm involved in this somewhat because back in the early 90s, Warren Cohen was approached by Cambridge University Press to do a 4-volume history of American foreign policy. And Warren asked if I would do the 1865 to 1912 volume. And I said I'd have to think about that because the very first book I published essentially went through the origins up through 1898, 1900, and I didn't know if I had a great deal to add to that. Anyway, I thought I was right, and I didn't have to say anything besides what I had said in that particular book. He put together 3 other historians. They were quite distinguished. Bradford Perkins did the first volume. Akira Irie of Harvard did the second volume, and then Warren did the third. And we published those in the middle 90s. They got very good reviews, except in one particular leading periodical where a German reviewer, a person who is the editor of Der Spiegel, said, you know, three of these volumes are really good, but Lefebvre's, I don't know about that one. I mean, he had some real reservations about that. And what he had real reservations about is what I'm going to argue to you today. I read the review and I didn't see any reason why I should change my mind because he didn't like my thesis. It also worried me a little bit that he used one quotation from a US congressman, as he identified it, to disprove my thesis. And I'd never heard of this guy. And I looked him up and I couldn't find him. And then I went to my good friend, we share an office together at Cornell, Joel Silby, who's a specialist on 19th century American politics, and he didn't know about this guy either. So I thought, I don't think I'll reconsider this book if this is the only evidence that this person is bringing to bear. Then, about 2 years ago, this same reviewers reviewed George Herring's new history of American foreign relations that Oxford published. It goes from the American Revolution up to the present. It pretty well ends in the 90s, but George takes the story into the Bush administration. The same person reviewed it and said some very nice things about George's book, but said the Cambridge 4 volumes were better. I immediately called George, who's a very good friend of mine, and pointed this review out to him so that he'd be sure to see that review and we could talk about it. And he said he had seen the review and he understood what was going on. What was going on was that at that point Cambridge decided it wanted to do a new edition of the 4 volumes that we had done back in the early 90s as a result of this review of Herring's book. And so that's what I've begun to do now, is a new edition of this 1865 to 1912 book. I'm just getting involved into it. I've had other things taking time. And what I want to do this afternoon is to run by some ideas, and particularly some of the new literature that has appeared since the first edition of this was published in 1993, 1994. And also make a few observations about the way the historical profession, particularly American foreign policy, has evolved in the last 15 to 20 years. Now, as I say, what I'd like to do, I think historians have actually come a very long way in the last 40 or 50 years in understanding the past and in making that past relevant to evolving U.S. foreign policy. When I was in graduate school, there were 3 leading historians. They all published texts, which if you had taken a course here in U.S. diplomatic history, U.S. foreign relations, you would have used one of their books. They were the 3 leading scholars. And it's interesting to go back and see what they said about this period we're discussing, the roots of the American empire, the roots of the American century. One of them was Thomas A. Bailey of Stanford, who sold more textbooks, I think, than anybody in his generation. And the way he did this, he was a good historian, he did his work, but he also emphasized American public opinion. And so he found these wonderful newspaper quotes which he used in the text, and they made American foreign policy very readable and very attractive to undergraduate students. But what came out of it was when Bailey talked about, for example, the War of 1898, he emphasized very strongly what he had put in the text, that is, American public opinion. Well, if you look at American public opinion in 1897-98, there's some problems with this. It's very unscientific, of course, one thing. There wasn't any, quote, scientific public opinion polls until the pollsters went down in flames in the 1948 election when Truman defeated Dewey. So when you're using public opinion in the 1890s, it's a very dangerous historical process. You've got to be extremely careful. And Bailey was really concerned about making it attractive rather than quasi-scientific, I guess is one way of phrasing this. The second historian was Julius Pratt, and Pratt was perhaps the most famous of the historians who worked on this period. Pratt published a very important book in which he said that there were suspicions that the reason the United States went to war in 1898, and of course that war opened up the entire 20th century U.S. foreign policy. I mean, it just, in a matter of 6 weeks, the United States transformed. And the big argument was, why did we do it? And a few people, Charles Beard was among them, one of the great historians of that time, said that economic factors were of some importance, and Pratt went back and disproved this to his satisfaction, and said that economic factors were not important, that instead there was something what he called the large policy. Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, a group of elite policymakers had gotten together and had decided this was the moment now for the United States to move out into the world and to become a competitor of the other great world powers, the British, the French, the Russians, and increasingly now the Japanese. So that was Pratt's thesis, and that's the thesis that we began with when I was in graduate school, that economic factors were not important, but that there were these elite groups of policymakers who took the United States into war. And then there was the third historian, Samuel Flagg Bemis of Yale, who was probably the most distinguished of these 3 historians. Bemis had written 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning volumes about John Quincy Adams and was a great historian of the American Revolution in the early 19th century. When he got into the 1880s, 1890s, he tended to have some problems because he was so pro-US, he couldn't imagine that the United States would ever do anything, quote, imperialistic, unquote, which was sort of a bad word to use in the 1950s and 1960s, early 1960s anyway. And so what Bemis argued was, yeah, we did go to war in 1898, yeah, we did take over Cuba, we took over the Philippines. We did actually send troops to the Chinese mainland in 1900 to help other imperial powers put down a Chinese Boxer rebellion. But Bemis concluded this was, quote, a great aberration in American history. That once Woodrow Wilson came in 1913, who was one of Bemis's favorites, Wilson straightened this all out, and we didn't do anything more like the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico. And that, again, had a hold on the American historical profession in the 1950s and 1960s. That, yeah, the United States had been imperialistic for a while, but it was an aberration. And we returned in the 20th century to being a much more democratic, open, free, non-imperialist power. By the 1970s and 80s, those three interpretations had all disappeared for the most part. They were not in anybody's textbooks except Bailey's, Pratt's, and Bemis's. They were not in the leading monographs of the time. And what had happened here had been essentially going back and looking at the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, rethinking, going to different sources, including, for example, using foreign archives, particularly the British archives, which were extremely interesting in their perception of what the United States was all about in the 1890s. And then going back, which was something that was pushed upon me in graduate school, looking at the domestic situation in the United States and how that shaped U.S. foreign policy. And he didn't mean, I mean, this didn't mean simply public opinion. This meant looking at a large number of groups. As I'll mention in a moment, one of the most interesting new groups, for example, are gendered groups that's moved into the historiography in the last 15 or 20 years. But what happened here was a complete difference of perspective opened up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to ask different questions, use different archives, come at it from different approaches, new kinds of cultural history, which was not studied, certainly not emphasized in most graduate schools in the 1950s and 1960s. And so what came out of this was a book I published in 1963, which argued there were economic factors involved, and then a number of other books that preceded and followed what I had done. And what I tried to do in the Cambridge History volume in the 1990s was to incorporate a lot of this to explain why the United States suddenly became a great power in 1898, because this was when we became a great power. Incidentally, Bailey was very good in identifying this. I can disagree with Bailey, who was my mentor during my master's program at Stanford. I can disagree with him about the role of public opinion, but he gave a presidential address to the Pacific Historical Association in which he said, you know, when the United States was founded in 1776, it was already a great power. That is to say, it was a power that other nations had to take into account. By 1998, we became a very great power. That is to say, we were one of the 4 or 5 great powers in the world. And I think he was right. And the British archives indicated he was right. The United States at that point, by 1900, was the #1 economic power in the world. We had been nothing like that in 1870. And in a generation and a half, we had overtaken the Germans and the British and the French to become the #1 economic power in the world. This is long before World War I, when we helped finance the war and helped bankrupt the British. This is when we're doing it on our own in Pittsburgh and Montgomery, Alabama, and a lot of other places where U.S. Steel Works and other U.S. production facilities are propelling the United States beyond the United States into this incredibly great world market that Americans had never acted in much other than sell cotton and some other raw materials. But now we were becoming, we were the nation that was furnishing a lot of finished manufactured goods as well. And at the same time, as we were doing this, we were starting to export cash, export capital for the first time. 1895, there was a very bad economic depression in the United States. And it looked as though the U.S. Treasury was going to go bankrupt. They were down to their last $100 million. It looked like they were going to go bankrupt. At the last minute, J.P. Morgan came in and saved the U.S. Treasury. Now, Morgan didn't get this money in the United States. In 1895, Morgan got that money in London. J.P. Morgan was dependent upon London to save the U.S. Treasury. And London came through. And J.P. Morgan, that is to say British bankers, saved the United States Treasury in 1895. 10 years later, just 10 years later, leading U.S. banks are financing the Japanese military effort against Russia in the Japanese-Russian War. In just 10 years. J.P. Morgan's on the sidelines. A lot of the banks in New York that are doing this are Jewish banks, headed by Jewish citizens who had been expelled from Russia during the pogroms, whose families had been persecuted during the Russian pogroms. They came to the United States. They became wealthy very fast. They moved out of the 1890s depression, where they took advantage of the depression to consolidate their holdings and their wealth. And by 1904, they were in a position to help the Japanese defeat the Russians and to gain retribution against the Russians for what the Russian Tsar had done to Jewish citizens ever since 1881. That's how fast the United States turned around, both economically and financially. So what we have here in 1898, 1900 is suddenly modern America, and especially modern America in terms of modern American foreign policy. In fact, in many respects, as you probably noticed in the last 6 to 12 months, we were in a lot better shape economically, say, in 1900 than we are right now. At least the Chinese at that point didn't hold $2 trillion of our debt. At that point, we were moving on the Chinese, not vice versa. And we were, by 1904, 1905, dealing from a superior position of strength with other major European powers. So, starting at this point, it was quite clear that the United States was the #1 economic power, and that we now had the resources to do a second thing. The second thing was to build a great U.S. fleet. This was the nature of power in the late 19th century. It wasn't the military, unless you were fighting Indian wars in the American West. And the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, did a very good job of that. But international power was on the seas. And by the late 1880s, the United States had begun building its first battleship fleet. And they had a long way to go. The U.S. Navy, by 1888, was one of the worst navies in the world. 1891, we got at cross purposes with Chile. The Benjamin Harrison administration almost went to war with Chile. And then the Benjamin Harrison administration looked at what would happen if the Chilean Navy and the American Navy met, and we'd lose. And Benjamin Harrison immediately worked out a deal with Chile to avoid war. 7 years later, the United States was one of the 4 or 5, depending on how you counted it, 4 or 5 greatest navies in the world. We had one of the 4 or 5 greatest battleship fleet navies in the world, the most modern navies, the most modern gunnery, and that was the basis for the United States fleet, of course, of the 20th century that fought World War I and World War II. Many of the ships that fought in World War I were ships that were developed between 1890, the first great battleship act, and 1898. So when the War of 1898 occurred, the Spanish fleet, which was a pretty decrepit fleet, had trouble getting across the Atlantic. And when it finally stumbled across the Atlantic, it took the American fleet literally hours to destroy the Spanish fleet and take over Cuba. The same thing happened in the Philippines. And all that happened, as I say, in 8 years, they built this kind of a fleet to control the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And we also, incidentally, devised a theory about how you do this. It was associated with a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who is still, I just noticed in the newspaper over the weekend, still referred to in the United States as one of the great strategic thinkers, and is a seminal figure in American military thought. And again, he came out of this 1890s battleship fleet. So here we are in 1900 with American economic power translated into American military power. Now there is a third thing that happens, and this is when it starts getting interesting to me. And this is what I did not see in the first book I published, but I did begin to see it when I did the Cambridge History volume. The United States becomes a great world power, to use Bailey's term, one of the 4 or 5 great powers, probably one of the 4 greatest powers. At the very moment that the world erupts into revolution. Our timing was very bad. We became a great world power with global responsibilities, which we were very happy to assume at the very time the world is starting to come apart. And I can list these revolutions for you. I mean, I'm sure they're familiar to most of you. You can start actually with the Cuban Revolution, which had started in 1878, resumes in 1895, and we move into the middle of it in 1898. Then there's the Philippine Revolution, 1899. That's against us in our occupation of the Philippines. And then there's what's called the first great 20th century revolution. That's Mexico in 1911. There's a smaller revolution actually in Iran in 1905. We're not all that much involved, although we do get involved in that 5 or 6 years later to a slight extent. There's a Mexican Revolution. Then there is the Chinese Revolution, one of the 2 great revolutions of the 20th century that begins, some people date it back to the Boxer Rebellion, which we were involved in 1900, but certainly a more meaningful date, I think, is 1911. And then there is the Russian Revolution of 1917. Then there are revolutions in Latin America, which are very important to us and in which we are intimately involved. Nicaragua. Many of us know from experience the revolution in Nicaragua in the 1980s. But the roots of that revolution go back to 1893-94. And the United States is very much involved in that revolution in 1893-94. To the extent that we essentially occupy much of Nicaragua on and off until 1911, 1912, and then occupy it for the next 20 years to try to maintain stability in the Nicaraguan Revolution. And then there's the Panamanian Revolution of 1903, which Theodore Roosevelt helped stimulate, of course. The Panamanians had actually revolted against the Colombians all through the 19th century. And many times we had sent ships to Panama to try to work out an agreement between the Colombians and the Panamanians to keep Panama and Colombia together. But in 1903, Roosevelt sent a ship which did not have that purpose, as we well know. The Panamanians had revolted, in part because Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay had encouraged them to revolt. When they revolted, a U.S. ship immediately showed up on the Atlantic side of Panama to keep out the Colombian ships and troops which were coming in to put down that revolt. And once that revolt was put down, at that point the Panamanians and the United States officials got together in Washington and signed the deal that led to the creation of the building of the Panama Canal. Now, I just misstated something. I said that in Washington, the Panamanians and the U.S. officials got together to sign the deal that led to the creation of the Panama Canal. That's not right. When we made that deal, there were no Panamanians there. The guy who made the deal was a Frenchman who had bought up the French rights to the canal from the 1880s. And when the Panamanians got on the train in Washington and got on the train in New York and got off the train in Washington and found out the deal he had made, they were really bitter and they began protesting. And it was too late. The treaty had already been signed. Theodore Roosevelt said, a deal's a deal. And he began, as he said, making the dirt fly. So the Panamanian Revolution is a little misnomer here. There was a Panamanian Revolution against Colombia, which we encouraged and supported and made sure Colombia did not stop. But when the deal was then made for the Panama Canal, the Panamanians were not involved. So there was a whole range of interesting and varied revolutions here. Now, in this third step, this revolutionary step, what began to fascinate me is that in nearly every instance, when the United States becomes involved in the revolution, the United States tries to stabilize the revolution. That is to say, to end the revolution, and instead makes it worse. In nearly every instance, the United States accelerates the revolution rather than stabilizes the revolution, in almost every single case. And you can go through those, and it's absolutely fascinating to see how the United States tries. I mean, the United States, you know, as I've said in so many words, has become a status quo power. When in the 18th and early 19th century, we were very pro-revolutionary because we were revolutionary. We even thought for a while the French Revolution was a good idea until we saw the bloodshed. Then we started changing our mind and said this was a weird revolution. It wasn't like ours at all. But we were very favorable to other revolutions in Europe in the first half of the 19th century, particularly the Hungarian revolutions, other revolutions in the 1840s. By 1900, Americans have changed. They are not pro-revolutionary nearly as much. In fact, in some instances, not at all. And we have become a status quo power, and we continue to be, of course, into the 21st century. But the irony of this, and it seems to me the importance of this, is understanding that when we got involved in these revolutions, invariably we made them worse. We accelerated them. Now, there's no one reason why we did this. They vary under circumstances, but we did it. And what I tried to trace through this book, and which really angered this reviewer I talked about a few minutes ago, was how this happened and why it happened. Because it seems to me that it's inarguable that the United States did this. And you can use all kinds of examples for this. The Cuban Revolution never quite got to that point. I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. The Philippine Revolution is sort of a case study of this. The United States moving into the Philippines during the war in 1898, the Filipinos believing that the United States was coming to help them become independent. And suddenly, when we accept the Spanish surrender of the Philippines, we exclude all the Filipino soldiers from the ceremonies. We did the same thing with Cubans in Cuba because we weren't sure whether or not they would tolerate Spain turning Cuba or the Philippines over to us. And by January of 1899, as the United States is trying to consolidate its power around the Philippines, gunfire breaks out and a revolution follows. Now, a lot of this is done according to the textbooks, and I think there's a great deal of truth in this, because of ignorance on the part of American policymakers what they're getting into. My favorite example of this is when some Methodist missionaries, a famous story, I'm sure many of you heard it, Methodist missionaries come to visit McKinley. And they say, what are you doing in the Philippines? And McKinley says, you know, I've been praying about this night after night after night. And it's finally come to me what we should do, and that is we should annex the Philippines. And it's only right that we do this. And then he says, incidentally, if we don't do it, the Japanese or the Germans might, and we don't want that to happen. But then he says, and we will Christianize the Filipinos, which is a fascinating statement since Spanish Catholicism had been there 400 years. And yet most Americans, including Americans who read diplomatic texts in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, read McKinley's statement and said, yeah, that's right. You know, the Filipinos were not, they must not have been Christians if McKinley wanted to Christianize them. There were a group of Filipinos who were not Christians. They were Islamic, and they were on Mindanao. And they were never, ever brought under control in the way that the rest of the Philippines were. And in fact, you can make the argument, although I have to admit it's an extended argument, that what happened in the Philippines with Islam and Mindanao in the 1890s is still going on in 2010. We're still, the Philippine government is still having problems with what we call radical Islam in parts of Mindanao. So these things have very deep roots, and they come out of in a sense, a misperception and a misunderstanding of what this is all about and our ability to control it. You can do the same thing with Mexico. You can do this, in Mexico, the story is pretty straightforward. In Mexico, a man named Diaz had been president ever since 1877. He had entertained a lot of U.S. investment. Those of you who know a lot about Mexico, please forgive me for my generalizations here and explaining Mexican history in 30 seconds. But by 1911, Diaz is an old man. He's run his course. It's quite clear that there is now another person, other people who want to take over, a man named Madero. And the United States is very interested in getting Diaz out of the way because Diaz has not been as open, particularly to U.S. oil interests in Mexico, as he had been in the 1870s and 1880s, and he seems to be favoring more British oil interests. And so as a consequence, we pressured Diaz to step aside, allow Madero to come into power. And when Madero does come into power finally in 1911, 1912, other parts of Mexico erupt. In other words, when the United States pressured Diaz to step down, it never occurred to us that what you might be doing here is triggering a political movement in Mexico which could get out of control. And suddenly Mexico begins to divide up. And Madero cannot control Mexico. And to make a long story short, in the early part of 1913, the American ambassador to Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, essentially talks to the people he thinks could stabilize Mexico. We always want to stabilize these onrushing revolutions, as I said. And as a result, he goes to these people, a man named Huerta, among others, and says, we no longer are in favor of Madero. We like what you're doing. We think you have the military power to essentially impose order and get some kind of orderliness back into Mexican politics. And Huerta says, what should we do with Madero? And Henry Lane Wilson essentially says, in so many words, do whatever you think is right. And 3 days later, the former president of Mexico was killed. And quite clearly, the United States ambassador was involved. And this leads now to essentially 3 to 4 years of near chaos in U.S.-Mexican relations, leading right up to 1917, when there are famous letters supposedly exchanged between Mexico and Germany, in which Germany tells Mexico that if they will help the Germans against the United States in World War I, Germany will help Mexico get back the southwestern part of the United States that the United States had taken away from Mexico in the 1840s. I mean, it's finally gotten to this point in 1917. So when you look at these revolutionary movements and the way the United States deals with them, they usually make the situation not only worse, but radically worse and more chaotic. And we could go through other examples, which I'll be glad to do if you have questions about it. But these are, I think, of particular interest. The Chinese Revolution is another one of particular interest. In the last 15 years, there's been a lot of work done on this period, and some of it I want to point out because I think it's interesting. It tells us something about the historical profession, and it also tells us something about how we understand and look at American foreign policy. One of the things that's happened in the American historical profession, of course, is the importance of gender. And there have been several books written on this period, 1880s, 1890s, that is really important from a gendered viewpoint. The best one is Kristen Hoganson's book that was published in 1998. She is a very fine historian at the University of Illinois. And what Hoganson does is to argue that American manhood, which is in her title, essentially is a key. Depending on how you read it, it is a key, which I think it is, or the key, which some people think it is, to understanding American imperialism in the 1890s. And she makes a very sophisticated, subtle argument here, which is very difficult to summarize. But let me give you one example, which I think will get you the a flavor of the argument. She argues, why did the War of 1898 occur? She says because it followed the economic depression of 1893. Well, some of us have been arguing that in the 60s and 70s. That out of that depression and out of the economic analysis of that depression, US officials, particularly presidents and secretaries of state, said, we've got to expand overseas to find markets for our surplus goods or we're going to be in eternal economic depression. Kristen Hoganson takes it in another direction. What did that depression do to American manhood, she asks? What did it do to the status of men in the family if they could not get jobs, if they could no longer lead that family? What did that do to the family structure, family structure in the United States? And she poses some fascinating questions out of that, and then comes to the conclusion that when men were essentially displaced in this sense in the middle 90s by the Depression, that one outlet they found was war. That if you wanted to prove your manhood, you went to war. Now again, I'm simplifying what she says. It's a much better argument than I'm making and much more subtle, but that's essentially the gist of it. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that it's quite clear that there was something going on in the 80s and 90s. We know, for example, that one of the things that happened in the 90s was an incredible flurry of individual physical activity. Bicycling suddenly took off. Football suddenly took off. College athletics suddenly took off. There were all-America teams suddenly by 1900. And in part, this is described by social historians as a reaction. Americans letting their frustrations out because of this economic depression. And what Hoganson is doing is say, you can also let it out by going to war and creating this new American empire in 1900. Now there's another book that came out also on gender, which I have a few problems with, but it's still an important book. It's a book by a woman named Gail Lederman, and she handles the entire problem of gender and American foreign policy from 1880 essentially down to World War I. It's a very good book. It's not nearly as sophisticated. It was published 3 years before Hoganson's book. It's not nearly as sophisticated as Hoganson's book, but it's a very good and important book. It has one problem that I think is serious, and it tells me a lot about how you can get in trouble in these kinds of books if you're not really careful. She has a chapter on Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, if you want to talk to somebody who had problems with his masculinity, you can start with Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt is a case study of American macho-ness run wild, the strenuous life and all that stuff, and we knew all that. And she uses Roosevelt beautifully. If you want to understand why Americans acted as they did in gendered terms, look at Theodore Roosevelt. That'll work it out for you. And you can quote Theodore Roosevelt from now to forever about the strenuous life and all of the related slogans. But there's a problem with this. I didn't look at this much until she and I were on a panel together at Southern Methodist University, and then I read that book very carefully. And it bothered me because she has Roosevelt saying these things straight through into World War I, till his death in 1919. But Roosevelt changed his policies in 1906, 1907, 1908 in a really stunning way that we don't recognize enough, and we should. Roosevelt had been the leading American imperialist in his first term down to 1905, to the point where he won a Nobel Prize it was awarded in 1910 because he became directly involved in the Russo-Japanese War and ended that war. He was American leadership. He had made the dirt fly in Panama. But in 1906, 1907, he went back and looked at the Japanese whom he had favored in the Russo-Japanese War. He had essentially taken the Japanese side, as he kept saying over and over again in his private letters. He did not like the Russians. He joined a long list of Americans in the 20th century on that one. He did favor the Japanese. By 1907, it was becoming clear that the Russians were in deep trouble. They had had an internal revolution in 1905, you know. That was the beginning of the seed time of the Russian Revolution of 12 years later. And the Japanese were building their power very rapidly. They had taken over Korea. They were moving into South Manchuria. They were starting to threaten the Chinese. And Roosevelt kept asking, is this why I favored the Japanese during the war? So they can close off Korea to us, which they did, close off South Manchuria, and close off parts of China to us. We needed those China markets, we believed. So Roosevelt in 1907 orders Plan Orange. Plan Orange is the war plan in which we fought World War II 34 years later. It went through many evolutions. But Roosevelt is becoming so scared that we are going to go to war with the Japanese that he's ordering war plans, and those war plans have a direct linkage to the war plans we finally used after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And what those war plans tell Roosevelt is, if we get involved in a war with Japan, it'll take the Japanese no more than 1 week to clean us out of the Philippines. And at that point, Roosevelt starts backing off. The first thing he does is order U.S. fleet out of the Philippines back to Hawaii. This is done very quietly. The next thing he does is to run against American diplomatic advice and make a deal with the Japanese to recognize Japanese rights in Manchuria, which nobody thought he would ever do, because we wanted those Manchurian markets. But he knows we cannot stand up to the Japanese. And then he does what's in all your textbooks. Then he sends the U.S. fleet around the world. Why does he do this? To show the Japanese we're tough. That's why he does it. There's a new biography of Roosevelt by a woman named Kathleen Dalton. It's one of the 2 best biographies of Theodore Roosevelt. The other one is Pringle's biography of 1931, still a classic. Dalton buys the entire story. I mean, it's a very good biography, but she buys the entire story of Roosevelt sending the fleet around the world, the famous visit of the U.S. fleet, the famous voyage of the U.S. fleet around the world. She buys the entire story that Roosevelt did this to make the Japanese stand down. He didn't do it at all for that. He did it out of fear that if he didn't do this, the Japanese might move towards Hawaii. And as a consequence, when the fleet does go around the world, incidentally, it gets as far as the Indian Ocean. This is the U.S. fleet, the great U.S. battleship fleet. It gets to the Indian Ocean and runs out of fuel. The Japanese noticed that. We finally got out of the Indian Ocean by borrowing fuel from the British fleet. Now, I mean, you know, if you're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and his macho-ness, there's not a whole lot of macho-ness in begging for fuel from the British fleet. What Roosevelt is doing here is bluffing. But underneath it all, in terms of substantive policy, he is bringing the United States out of Asia. And he keeps on this course after he leaves the presidency. By 1911, he is giving speeches on behalf of the progressives. And he's writing articles in the Outlook periodical. And in one of these speeches, he says, what are American foreign policy interests? And he tells us what he thinks American foreign policy interests are. To the south, they're the Panama Canal, and to the west, it's Hawaii. That's it. We have no interest in Asia, no interest in Korea, which he has essentially now allowed the Japanese to take over. We have no interest on the Chinese mainland, which Americans had been after for the China market, and American missionaries had been after for 100 years. Roosevelt is essentially telling the progressives, we've got to pull it in because we do not have the power to take on the Japanese. Now, if you use a gendered analysis, and Roosevelt's talking the same way as a tough guy all through these years, the gendered analysis doesn't work, because he's talking one way and acting quite differently. Christian Hoganson does not make that mistake, nor do many other good gender studies. One other book that I'd mention that I think is really helpful because it comes from the historian who is our leading historian of U.S.-Cuban relations, is Luis Perez's series of books. He's published a half a dozen major monographs. And Perez has, for those Americans who read his work, I think has allowed us to understand Cuba, and particularly the roots of American-Cuban relations, better than any other historian ever has. There's one particular important part that Perez discovered and has become a central part of his story, and that is at the moment McKinley decides to go to war in April of 1898, at the moment the President of the United States decides we're going to go to war, he does so in part because he's afraid that the Cubans are going to win the war against Spain. That is to say, we're going to go in to Cuba to protect the Cubans against Spain. That's what McKinley tells the Americans. But he's going in actually to make sure the Cubans don't win. And the reason for that is he mistrusts the Cuban revolutionaries. He believes that the Cuban revolutionaries defeat the Spanish, and they're coming very close to it in the spring of 1898. That the next thing they'll do is move on U.S. property in Cuba, including $50 million of U.S. investments, particularly in sugar. And at that point, McKinley says, we're going. And we're not going in to save the Cubans, in so many words. We're going in to make sure the Cubans do not control Cuba, or the Cubans we can control will control Cuba. We found this out in part by Perez's work in Cuban archives, and in part because of the release half a century later, after it happened, of McKinley's private secretary, George Cortelyou, and McKinley talking to Cortelyou about these problems. So Perez's work here has really been instrumental. You can imagine what the Castro government does with this when they found out what McKinley had said in 1898. And it has not helped U.S. foreign policy, but it's accurate history, and that's what Perez is after. There is finally a book I'll mention very quickly, and that's a book edited by Al McCoy and Francisco Scarano called Colonial Crucible, which just came out last year. And anybody who is interested in the roots of the American Empire has to look at this book, even though it's about 700 pages long. It's a series of essays by, must be 30 or 40 scholars. It came out of a series of meetings in the Netherlands in which there were dozens of countries represented. And what this book does is, as McCoy and Scarano talk about it in the introduction, so they start out by saying the wonderful thing about the Russians going down in 1991 and the end of the Soviet Empire is that now we can use the word empire with the United States. During the Cold War, you couldn't say there was an American empire because it sounded like you were pro-communist. But after 1991, that language is to the side, and you can now use the word empire and begin analyzing it. And what these essays do is to look, for example, at schools that the United States set up in various parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. Medical facilities, all kinds of social, cultural facilities, not just the diplomatic relationships, but essentially the guts of a society, and how the United States went in to try to structure these societies in various ways to make them more American, to make them more understandable and appealing and cooperative with us. It's a very powerful, excuse me, it's a very powerful book. And it's done from a multinational point of view with many of the new gendered and class and race categories in the book. It's opening up, I think, it's going to open up a whole generation of research into this period, so we'll have a much, much better understanding of exactly how we became a world power, which is, I must say, a much more fascinating story to me now than it was when I was in graduate school reading Bemis, Pratt, and Bailey. I'll be glad, I talked longer than I should have, but I'll be glad to take questions or comments or telling me off or whatever. Yes?
So you said that the emergence of the fleet is bad timing because of the revolutions that were happening at the time. And you're saying that that's because it enabled us to get the wall controls?
Yeah. You know, if the Americans had really been lucky, we would have become a great world power when things were pretty stable, if they ever are stable. We happened to become a great world power and to feel responsibility for that power at a point when the world was, many of the sectors we were involved in were coming apart. And I never noticed, I must say, I taught this for 30 years and I never noticed it until about the 31st year, that the United States assumed responsibility as a major power at a time when those responsibilities were very different than they had been a generation or two before, and were much more dangerous and explosive than they were before. And we sort of walked into that very willingly. There was a great Harvard professor named Ernest May, who just died 2 years ago, who wrote on the 1890s. And he used Shakespearean language and metaphors to say that our empire was imposed upon us. And I have never bought that, and most of the people I know in the field have never bought that, but that is a perspective. As I see it, you know, these revolutions were not imposed upon us, and our responsibility was not imposed upon us. We went looking for this. McKinley did not have to go into the Philippines in 1898. That's the first time the United States ever sent troops out of the Western Hemisphere. And McKinley did it without ever consulting Congress. He simply ordered 15,000 US troops to move over to the Philippines as fast as possible, to occupy the Philippines after Admiral Dewey took the... Now this is not having empire imposed upon us. This is reaching out and grabbing it with both hands, and he had a reason for it. It wasn't that, you know, he was going to Christianize the Philippines. He was not that naive. It was that he knew we were in an all-out war for markets in China, and out of the depression of the 1890s, those markets were crucial to us. And unless we had a naval base close, and Manila would be perfect for that in the Philippines, it would be extremely difficult for the United States to compete with the other powers who had bases all around, and particularly Japan. So, you know, there's various points of views here, but the one thing I don't think you can argue is that Americans either stumbled into empire or had empires imposed upon us. But, I mean, you're talking to somebody who's, you know, very convinced about this. Yes?
I have a question on the occupation of the Philippines from, I can't remember the dates. When did we send troops to the Philippines again?
I didn't get the last part.
I said, when did we send troops to the Philippines again? I'm trying to get the dates straight.
On the occupation of the Philippines?
Yeah. This isn't, my main question was going to be, what we did to suppress the population of the Philippines constitute genocide?
What we did to suppress the population?
Because I've read about Arthur MacArthur's actions in the Philippines, and we did some pretty brutal things.
Yeah, we did some pretty brutal things. There was an article you probably saw by Paul Kramer in the New Yorker 2 years ago, I think now. Kramer is a very fine historian who is now Johns Hopkins, who did a book on the 1890s and sort of the origins of the American Empire. and one of the things he ran across, and he wrote about it in this really superb article in the New Yorker, and it got to a large audience because of this, was the torture that American troops used, including waterboarding, which we've heard a lot about in the last 7 years. US troops used waterboarding against Filipinos, and there were other forms of torture. It was brutal. I mean, there were 4,500 Americans killed in that, and the estimate is there were 200,000 Filipinos killed. It was a brutal all-out war with torture. It took the Filipinos a long time to get over that, and a lot of the Filipinos tried to pay us back during World War II by essentially working with the Japanese. And that's the one, I must say, one group that I understand what they're doing. some of those people had experienced the U.S. occupation and the U.S. war between 1898 and 1903. And Arthur MacArthur, as you mentioned. It had a long legacy in the Philippines. And one of the interesting things, you know, for a historian is, why wasn't this in American textbooks in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s? It's in there now, but it's in there about a century later than it should have been. It's not one of the United States' great chapters in our history, but it is, I think, one of the representative chapters of what we were doing at this time. As critical and as almost nauseous as that is to say. There were similar things going on in Central America. Yeah.
I wonder if you could clarify your use of the term stabilization of revolutions. It wasn't clear to me what the purpose of the stabilization was. Was it to support the revolutionaries, or to support the occupying power or the indigenous elite at the time to put down the revolution? It just wasn't clear to me what the essential purpose of that stabilization.
I use stabilization in two senses. One was stabilization immediately after the U.S. occupation, an attempt to essentially impose a stable society and a stable political system, that is to say, a predictable political system, and one that you could sign contracts with, for example. But I think there was a second way of stabilization, and that is once that got out of control, and once you moved into a revolutionary situation or an anti-U.S. Rebellion situation, as in the Philippines or as in Nicaragua, for example, or in Cuba before we headed it off, I think stabilization took on a different meaning. I think it meant using military force if necessary in order to provide a status quo that was manageable. It didn't mean democracy. It didn't mean social pluralism. It meant some kind of imposed stability that had enough stability and peace in it that it was manageable. One of the really good new books, and I think I mentioned in passing, is Robert Hannigan's book called The New World Power. That's Hannigan. Hannigan looks at this period from the 1890s to 1917, and at one point in the book he says, to American policymakers and to Americans at this time, stability was more important than peace. He says that on page 271 if you want to look at it. Because I was stunned by that. I've known Hannigan. He was an undergraduate at Cornell, and I knew him and admired his work when he was an undergraduate. And he spent 30 years, 25 years putting this book together. And I ran across that sentence on page 271, and it really stopped me. And I backed up and what does he mean by stability? Your question. And what he means is that Americans had come to the position by 1900 that stability was not automatic. That Americans coming out of our own situation could assume that it was, as long as, say, we forgot about the Civil War. But that if Americans had to make a choice, they would choose stability over peace. That's what Hannigan's arguing here, and supports it with 300 pages of pretty good evidence.
Stability meaning manageable by us.
Manageable by us, and predictable. Something that's predictable. A revolution is not predictable. Stability is predictable. Yes?
So you said that the U.S. generally made the revolutions worse. Are there cases in history of outside powers coming in and actually helping a revolution? France and the United States. That's a loaded answer. But that's a situation where the French, for their own interests, of course, moved in to block the British. There's very few instances I know of in the 20th century where intervention into revolution makes the situation better. I mean, the case study of this
we all know, is the Russian Revolution between 1917 and 1920. First the Japanese, then the British, then the Americans. And each of the interventions makes the situation worse, not only in terms of the Bolshevik government being in power, but makes the situation worse in terms of the relationships among the Americans, the Japanese, and the British. They deteriorate as well. And I think there are a number of examples like that. The United States and Central and Latin America in the 20s and 30s is a very good example. But, you know, in 2004, I think I mentioned in passing, when Le Monde looked at the United States and Iraq, they weren't talking about Afghanistan yet. I think we could now. But when Le Monde in May of 2004 talked about the United States and Iraq, they talked about it in exactly the same terms that I've been talking about it this afternoon in the 1890s. The United States goes into Iraq. It has the hope of imposing stability and a regime that will be friendly. Instead, we make the situation worse. And as we make the situation worse, we up the ante of the militarization of the situation. And what that brings, to bear is more opposition and another escalation of the militarization. And when Le Monde writes about this in the middle of 2004, essentially asks the question, when will Americans stop making this worse? And I guess we're still trying to answer that question. But you know, what I'm pointing out here is what we did here in Iraq has very deep roots in the way we've acted and the way we've operated and the way we've assumed our policies for a very long time. I'm not saying the Philippines in the 1900s like Iraq in 2004. I'm not arguing that at all. I'm saying there's a certain familiarity of how Americans look at these things and define them and go into them without fully understanding exactly what some of the ramifications might be, even though we've been through those ramifications over and over again. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I spent a lot of time in Central America in the 1980s, in particular. We were looking at inevitable revolutions. It was one of the books that really helped me understand the history there. And
Thank you.
Guatemala, we got another case study in 1954
yes.
about what you're talking about. And then, well, 30 years later, the U.S. Embassy is saying, well, we wouldn't give it for an arguments now. You know, they had a genocide launch. But I'm wondering if you see that pattern was so pervasive throughout the 1980s. Do you see that pattern changing much in Central America? Do you still to see that kind of the economic alteration stuff like that is just keeping that pattern going of ongoing intervention that makes these revolutions at some point explosive?
I've been away from Central America for a long time. I did a second edition of that book in the 90s, and I really haven't gone back and stayed up with it like I should. So I'm sure you've got a much more informed opinion than I have. What strikes me right now is that the United States is at the position in Central America where we believe we do not have to intervene. We thought we did in the 1980s, and we did. I mean, even though there were congressional laws against it, we did. But now we're not doing it nearly as explicitly. And we feel that we can control, for example, the Honduran situation, Zelaya's removal, and how we responded to that. We went in a number of different directions, but I think the conclusion of that was that we could live with just about anything that resulted. If Zelaya came back, fine. If somebody else did finally come back, that would be fine too, because we thought we could manage that situation all the way through. Same thing in El Salvador. The one question right now, and again I'll defer to you on this, that I see in Central America that's really interesting is Nicaragua. Because the government of Nicaragua is the old Sandinista leadership of 1980s that we tried to blow up. And we thought we'd gotten rid of in an election in 1990. And Nicaragua is doing some really interesting things. And they're lining up in the United Nations with the Russians right down the line against us and recognizing Russian actions on the periphery of Russia, in which we're trying to get the UN to condemn Russia, and the UN's happy to do it. Nobody's standing much with Russia except Nicaragua. And I'm waiting sooner or later for Obama and Secretary of State Clinton to discover this and do something about it. But I think they've got other things that are more important, and I think they figure that the Nicaraguans, you know, are really pretty peripheral to American major interests right now, and Central America is as a whole, as long as it doesn't go any farther than this. Yeah, what's really happening, and I'll talk a little bit about this tonight, but what's really happening in Latin America that's so much more interesting is not Nicaragua cooperating with China. It is, I mean, Nicaragua cooperating with Russia. It's China moving into Latin America in ways that are just impossible for us. I'd give anything if Theodore Roosevelt could come back for one day. I mean, Roosevelt thought the Chinese were incapable of feeding themselves. I mean, he used words about the Chinese that were really execrable. To the point where the Chinese in 1904, 1905 finally launched a boycott of American goods. That's the only time Roosevelt ever sat down and thought that the Chinese might be able to defend themselves, at least, you know, for a couple days in limited areas. Otherwise, he totally looked down on the Chinese, which is why he favored the Japanese so much. He considered them civilized and the Chinese uncivilized. The categories then were very simple. Chinese are now, you know, the Chinese policy is taking a form which just blows apart the way Americans have defined and dealt with China in the last 200 years. And I think that lasted into the 1980s. I don't think anybody expected China to be what they were in the 90s and now. It'd be wonderful. Roosevelt would have some interesting things to say about China now. I mean, if he could grasp it. It might totally blow his mind and he'd just die again. Yeah.
What strikes me as unique about the United States is that it's never seemed to embrace the imperial identity as more traditional empires have, such as the British or the Japanese. And so my question is, if you agree with that supposition, what the effects of that and the reasoning behind that have been on the American psyche and the way in which American empire has conducted itself.
Give me the, excuse me, I didn't get the very first part of your statement.
America, at least internally within the culture, has never seemed to embrace the imperial identity,
yes,
like traditional empires have. And so I was wondering if you agree with that, if you would comment on the reasoning behind that and how that's affected the American psyche and the way in which it's conducted empire.
Sure. That's a central question in American history, not just American foreign policy. I mean, it's a central question in American history. Why haven't Americans been reluctant to call themselves empire builders? I mean, we started out with 13 colonies and ended up with 50. That's not bad. That's a good start. And when other people look at us and notice what we did in a period of about 120 years, 140 years, you know, that's pretty admirable empire building. But we never thought of it as an empire, and I think with good reason, for several reasons. One was because that area was integrated on equal terms with the original 13 colonies. Again, we had to fight a civil war, in part, over that west. But we got through that. I think a better answer to your question is not so much that we did that. I think there are two other things. One is that Americans don't like the word empire because it has connotations of Nazism and communism. It's not a, when I had to title my first book, which was called The New Empire, I made it very clear that I had stolen that title from a person in 1902 who was very patriotic, Brooks Adams. And I used the title from his book. And then I really chickened out because the subtitle was an interpretation of American, and at that point I didn't know whether to use the word imperialism or expansion. And I used the word expansion. I totally chickened out. And I figured if I used the word imperialism, that book would get ripped in reviews without ever having been read, because in the 1960s when you did that, you were asking for trouble. I mean, you were identifying yourself with imperialism. And you're identifying the United States with imperialist powers. That is to say, communism. So Americans have a problem with language. and using this language accurately. That's why this Scarano and McCoy book that I mentioned a minute ago, they said, thank God for the collapse of the Soviet Union. After 1991, we can use the word empire. Now, that's part of it. I think another part of it is that Americans have not been the colonial powers like the Europeans. We were not. And indeed, we rebelled against that system in 1776. And we helped other people rebel through the 19th century, as I said in the presentation. But then what we discovered, and there's been a lot of work done on this, is that what we wanted was not a colonial empire. For example, we did not want to annex Cuba. We did not want Cuba as a colonial empire. Why? Because we didn't want those races in the United States in 1898. We were lynching blacks at a record pace in the 1890s. And we did not want to incorporate Cubans. We could incorporate some Puerto Ricans. They were many fewer in number, and they were much more amenable. They were not Cuban revolutionaries. The race issue here was all important in understanding why Americans would not follow the Europeans in colonizing. Instead, what we try to work out is something that historians have come to call the open door policy, which is what we want to do is trade with everybody on an equal basis. We don't want colonies. And in fact, we are anti-colonial because if you own a British colony, you will have advantage over us if you're British in our trading with that colony. So we want you to get rid of colonies. We've been anti-colonial. 1945, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in one of the most missed stories of our Vietnam experience, goes after the French Empire and tries to work it out so Vietnam will become independent. When Ho Chi Minh gets up in Vietnam, in what's now Ho Chi Minh City, in 1945 and starts reading the Declaration of Independence, that was not accidental, as they say. That was because he knew the United States was anti-French. Now, in the end, we weren't. Very complex series of circumstances, we ended up with the French. But Americans on the whole have been very anti-colonial because we wanted to break down the colonial barriers so we could trade. We went after the British imperial preference system with a vengeance in the 1930s and 40s. And we did destroy much of that, to the point where the British pound nearly collapsed in 1949 because of what we had done to the British imperial preference system. I mean, you know, Americans, we have not been sitting around waiting for all these things to come to us. But that answers your question. We are anti-colonial. But that doesn't mean we are anti-imperialistic. I mean, what we're doing in some parts of the world, as Limon pointed out in Iraq, is pretty dominating. Yes?
Would you say that the way the United States uses economic influence is a form of imperialism?
The United States uses economic influence?
I mean, we're a financial powerhouse beyond understanding.
Sure. Sort of everybody does it.
Yeah. My question, what I was trying to lead to is, while we don't, I mean, even before the 21st century, before the 20th century, while we don't claim to exert military force to gain control of other nations, the Europeans did we not use our economic influence to overtly persuade them?
Overly persuade them? I see what your argument is, and I think I agree with a part of it. It's got to be handled very carefully. When you're dealing with Europeans, it's very different than dealing with Filipinos, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, in terms of the proportion of power, economic or any other, between the two sides. When the United States went into Europe in the late 1940s with the Marshall Plan, for example, we did a lot of dictating to the Europeans about how they were to handle this and what we would do. But it was a much more equal negotiation and discussion for all kinds of reasons that I'm sure we understand than it was when the United States was involved in the other episodes that I've been talking about this afternoon. In those episodes, the United States could use its economic power quite powerfully and quite effectively. But there was always a limit. You know, in Mexico we had a lot of oil power, but there was a limit to how much American oil companies could do in Mexico, since there were other, particularly British oil companies, that were always contested. So you've got to handle the way you formulate that very carefully in terms of what geographical area you're talking about and what the economic equality is like, and what the circumstances are in terms of U.S. military authority over that relationship, as it was, for example, with us in Latin America.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.